Rabbi Kahn was saying his goodbyes to his congregation after Sabbath service, as he always did, and Esther came up to him and said, "Rabbi, I've got terrible news." And he said, "Esther, what's the matter?" And she said, "My husband passed away last night." And he said, "Oh, Esther, that's terrible. Did he have anything to say before he died?" And she looked at him and she said, "Yes." He said, "Please, Esther, put down the gun." You know, when we talk about traditions, we talk about things like there's a story about a woman who always cut the edge of her brisket before she cooked it. And for those of you who don't know brisket, it's a cut of meat that most Jewish people use because it pots really well, and for whatever reason, it happens to be a kosher part of the animal. So, so this story, it's whatever time of year, maybe it is Passover, and they're cooking a brisket, and so the young woman cuts a piece of it off and puts it in another pan. And her someone who was there said, "Why did you do that?" And she said, "Well, I don't know, but my mother always did that." And so she turned around and said, "Mom, why did we do that?" And she said, "I don't know, because your grandmother did that." And so lastly, they say, "Okay, we'll ask your great grandmother." And she said, "Well, in those days, I didn't have a pot big enough to put it in, so I cut off a piece and I put it in another pot." Traditions, traditions. So the message, for several generations, nobody thought anything about this except there was a reason, but nobody knew. And in other words, traditions have a way of becoming self-validating entities. They persist even when the practical reasons for their continued observance no longer exists. You know, traditions can make us feel at home. They reassure us in a sea of change. And we need this safe harbor of a tradition. In the purest sense of the word, anything that gets passed down from generation to generation becomes a tradition. And when we value those things and love that they've been handed down to us, I miss it when things I've done before get changed. But the world right now is a sea of change. And one of the most enjoyable shows I've ever seen and is Fiddler on the Roof. And so I saw it now for the seventh time. We were talking about that. Actually, it ran for over 5 decades on Broadway. And I saw it every time on Broadway. My mother, who was a live theater junkie, made sure that we had tickets for every first performance of every Broadway show that there ever was. I mean, it was just her thing. She would leave my father home with my brother, and we would go. Yes. And the show itself found the right balance for its time, even if it was not entirely authentic. But it was one of the most popular post-Holocaust depictions of the vanished world of Eastern European Jewry. Now, Zero Mostel, who was born Samuel Joel Mostel in 1915 in Brooklyn, New York, and he was one of 8 children who played Tevye in that original Broadway production. Sammy was raised in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, 2 blocks from where my grandparents lived their whole lives. Now, Fiddler on the Roof is a classic story about a Russian Jewish family just before the revolution. Just about the time of the turn of the century is when my grandparents fled from Russia. And the story does several things for you. For one thing, Jews just love their traditions. I'm not saying that other people don't, but Jews in particular love their traditions, especially the Orthodox Jews. And this sense of history, they love Passover and their festivals and their rituals. And when I lived right off of Granada and that huge Hasidic temple that they built there, on their marquee was always something, some ritual, something going on. They even tell you when to light your Shabbos candles. Now, the original Fiddler on the Roof was about Tevye, who was a bumbling Jewish patriarch and a poor milkman, and his wife Golda, and the resilient, who was the resilient Jewish mother, and their three lovely daughters. Now, the original had three lovely daughters. I don't know, I think this one we saw last night, there were five, three, whatever, five, okay. Now, this story is a story of really a matchmaker and tradition, because they are trying to find husbands for their three daughters. Now, there came the song, I don't know if anyone of you remembers, the matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match, find me a find, catch me a catch. Now, the picture behind me is a picture of my grandparents. Tom had said, you always talk about your family. Do you have any pictures? And I came across this picture. Now, the couple seated are my grandparents. The woman above them is my mother. This is their 70th wedding anniversary. Now remember, they were married. My grandfather was 15. My grandmother was 13. It was a match. It was a match. He came to the United States first, and a year later she came over. But they were already married. Now, I remember asking my grandmother when I was old enough to understand what that really meant, this matchmaking. And I said, Mom, did you love Poppy? And those of you who have seen the Fiddler on the Roof, there's a beautiful Do You Love Me? And I was tossed up whether I should use that song or the one I used. And she said, Susan, in those days, it was not really about love, although Golda sings, do I love you? For 25 years I've cooked for you, washed for you, slept with you. Do I love you? Anyway, she said, in those days, I mean, in the show, it shows that it's kind of a matchmaker thing. Oh my God, he's 50 years old, he's portly, but he's rich, And I don't believe it was like that for my grandparents, because my grandmother said it was very much a real match, a match of intelligence, a match of many things, not just of money. And she said, when I finally got to speak to your grandfather, we realized that we had a lot in common. And so it was that beginning of commonality, of knowing all the people around us. She said, and I grew really to love your grandfather. What is love about anyway? It's about respect, and it's about kindness. It's about goodness and about the traditions that we share. And so, back to Fiddler. So it happens one day that Golda, they make arrangements for their daughter Tzeitel to marry this really rich man. But Tzeitel has plans of her own, and she's fallen in love with Myrtle the tailor. And so, poor Tevye, he needs to decide what he's going to do. So, out of love, he decides when they come to him and they ask him, he says, well, okay, blessings. Traditions are starting to change, I guess. And then the second daughter is the same story. But she didn't use the matchmaker. She went off to marry a soldier who was in Siberia. And then the third daughter, the same story all over again. But this time, the worst thing happened. She fell in love with a non-Jew. He was a Bolshevik soldier. And to marry a non-Jew, a Gentile, was really unforgivable. It was a sin. And so when the couple came to Tevye, he just couldn't bend the tradition any further. And so he refused to bless her. And he declared her dead, ripped his shirt, which is just a Jewish custom. And sadly, at the end of the story, the revolution is starting, and the Jews, including Tevye and Golda, are moving. They're fleeing to America, wherever they're going, and never to see each other again. And the most touching scene in the whole movie is when the third daughter comes with her non-Jewish husband and wants to say goodbye and be blessed. And Tevye does the most awful thing. He turns his back on her. And it's very tragic. The ending is very tragic. And so we think about traditions and how poor Tevye, who is really a good man, but traditions were more important to him than the commandment to love and to forgive, as God commands us to love and forgive. Now, the theme song from Fiddler, tradition, tradition, that's what today's gospel is all about. How the Pharisees make a priority of tradition over love. The Pharisees in the Gospels today were more committed to their religious traditions than carrying out the fundamental commandment of God for love, mercy, and justice in a miserable world. Here in this Gospel, we read about the Jewish leaders, the scribes. Now, the scribes acted as the secretaries of state, if you would. They were more political. And the Pharisees, who were, in a sense, church people. Their interests were more spiritual and laid in the synagogue. Now, they were very good people. These were not evil people. Sometimes in our superficial reading of the New Testament, we think the scribes and the Pharisees are bad people. But they're not. They were good, upstanding people. They were dedicated, just like Tevye was dedicated. And these scribes and Pharisees, like Tevye, had their religious traditions. So one day this group of tradition-loving Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "Jesus, do you see what's happening over there? Your disciples are starting to eat and they didn't wash their hands. Don't you know that all good Jews wash their hands before dinner as a sign of reverence to God? And your disciples aren't doing that. Jesus, what are you going to do about that?" And Jesus said to them, quote, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandments of God in order to keep your traditions. In fact, you Pharisees are so loyal to your traditions in order to avoid doing the commandments of God for love and mercy. Your religion becomes a replacement for doing the compassionate work of God in the world." "Well, Jesus," they replied, "we wash our hands before meals, we say grace, and we go to church every Friday. Tradition, we have our traditions." We hear the echoes. Tradition, tradition. In the gospel, Jesus teaches us two lessons. First is a matter of priorities. Many Jewish people had a priority for their traditions over the commandment of love. And secondly, and more subtly, that often their religious traditions became replacements for carrying out God's work of compassion and justice in the human misery of the world. I think you realize that history is filled with examples of Christians and Jews fighting and killing each other over conflicts of religion. And some of the most bloody chapters in history come when people put traditions over and make them more important than love. And then the Christian faith, rather than a source of harmony, love, and oneness, becomes a source of conflict. People have fought over and died whether the earth was round or square, whether man evolved from an ape or not. And the same problem exists today. Now, remember this story, Gulliver's Travels. I don't know how many of you have read that. But it is a classic example of people fighting over trivia and traditions. The story of Lilliput. Gulliver was on his way to Lilliput, and when he got there, he found that there was a party in Lilliput that believed that eggs should be cracked at the big end. And there was another party that thought that eggs should be cracked at the little end. And so the big enders and the little enders began to have a battle. And the big enders and the little enders fought to the death, to the complete ruin of the whole country. The issue was strategic. Are eggs to be cracked at the big end or at the little end? Ridiculous. Well, so often in church we have similar kinds of battles over trivia, over things that really don't matter, and ultimately issues that history usually forgets. And worse yet, in the middle of conflicts, God's invitation for love, mercy, and justice are forgotten. Religious traditions change, but Christian love is never withdrawn, and God never withdraws his love for us when we don't live up to his expectations. Paul says that nothing can separate us from the love of God, neither height nor depth, nor principalities, nor powers, nothing. Our traditions, our theology, nothing. Nothing is to become so serious a matter that one withholds the love and mercy of God. Nothing. Another point that Jesus is teaching today is equally true, that sometimes religious people, ordinary people like you and me, use religion as a replacement for doing the commandments of love, mercy, and justice. Religion then becomes a replacement for love. Pretty obvious that church activity should in no way be a substitute for involving yourself in life. The purpose of Jesus is to permeate all of life. The Christian faith is not to be the occasion where love is withdrawn from the suffering of the world. But unfortunately, that always happens because there's a large number of people in this world who mistakenly and naively make their absorption in the church as an excuse for withdrawing from the struggles of human misery. Tradition. People have always seemed to have time for their traditions and their rituals. Now, what I'm trying to say today is true for all of us. It's true for you, it's true for me. And God still loves us in all our sinfulness, in all our selfishness, in all our busyness. And the purpose of my sermon is not to make us feel guilty or to go home and tell somebody that you were scolded by the pastor. But I do think that Jesus was profoundly right when he suggested that people of God do love their religious traditions more than doing the commandments of mercy, love, and justice. There are all kinds of practices and church things we need to mentally diminish so that they don't become more important in our thinking about God's commands. You know, the songs we sing, the instruments we use, what translation of the Bible you read, church buildings, everything in them, what time we meet on Sunday, the order of the service, where you sit in the building. For heaven's sake, don't lose that seat. Every one of them is a matter of opinion, culture, or taste. Every one of them is not addressed in the Bible. And yet, every one of them are issues over which congregations have been split. Let's paint the ceiling pink. No, I want the walls to be blue. So, I hope you leave here with a few good applications of these essentials. 1, hang on to truth tightly. Let's make sure when we're stubborn about something, when it comes to church things, that it means we need to hang on and insist on the truth of God's word. Hang on to traditions loosely. That means we need to allow for changes and other opinions concerning things that the Bible doesn't say. In matters of faith, unity, opinion, liberty, in all things love. Work hard to create traditions that uphold truth. We're going to establish traditions. It takes doing something only once, and all of a sudden it becomes a tradition. Well, we've done that before. The very newest ideas becomes a tradition if it gets repeated. So why not concentrate on establishing traditions that are worth being stubborn over? Let's be stubborn over our determination to reach the lost. Let's make loving people a repeated practice that we're not going to give up. Those are some great traditions. Let's work hard to create them in the church and in our homes. A rural congregation was working on improving its worship service. And for as long as anyone could remember, there was always a large piece of white cloth over the communion table until it was that part of the service. It was just the way they did it. And then someone asked, what if we were to quit putting that cloth over the Lord's Supper? That would save a lot of time, and then nobody would have to take it home and wash it. And besides, it has to be cleaned so oftenly. Well, they've been doing it for years, but no one could remember why. Finally, an old-timer said, What had happened was years before, they didn't have any air conditioning. So they took this white cloth and they put it over the wine and the bread so that the flies wouldn't get on it. That was a tradition. Silly, right? Understandable, but nobody ever questioned it. They just kept doing it. Now, there's something I want to leave here with you realizing. We want to value life and live it to its fullest. While a sense of tradition is desirable and necessary at times, a problem occurs when tradition is substituted for true worship or true faith. When the actions associated with our traditions become more important than the meaning of the traditions, we can get sidetracked. The Pharisees were more concerned with strict observance of Jewish laws than they were about true faith in God. They were concerned about not letting germs and pollutions into their bodies. But Jesus said that they should be more concerned about the filth that comes out of our mouth. And we know what that is. The Pharisees were concerned about the letter of the law, including their rules and regulations. But Jesus emphasized the spirit of the law. It's important to be aware of Christian leaders who appear to be very religious in their actions, but who are really glorifying themselves instead of glorifying God. We should never honor anyone above God. Each and every one of us has a health problem, and not just a physical one. It's a heart problem. The heart is a fountain out of which much that affects our lives flow. The world is very enticing, but for its pull to work, we have to want what it's offering. We do stupid stuff because it's our human nature. When we give in to temptation, we have no one to blame but ourselves. Jesus wants us and his disciples to see the core of the issue is always comes down to what's in your heart. When God looks at us, the first things he sees is the state of our heart. God doesn't care about what we look like on the outside. He's more concerned about what's on the inside. He has more sympathy and compassion for the poor beggar in rags who has true faith than he does for the rich rulers who wear fine clothes but have rotten hearts and souls. We're free to accept the grace to choose God's mercy. If our hearts belong to God, nothing else matters. Our relationship with God is so much more than old, empty traditions. It's a daily adventure of growth. It's a life with purpose in the world we're living today. And finally, I'm certain that you want to know what Tefka meant leaving Anatevka when he said, maybe that's why we always wear our hats. You might think it was because they were always on the move. But for the Orthodox Jew, always covering the head is a demonstration of their awareness that there is something which is infinitely above their intellect and symbolizes their humility, acceptance, and love in the presence of God. And you know what? We don't have to be Jewish to use a bit of that thinking. I don't know about you, but for me, I'll take that thinking, but you can keep the hat. Amen.